There's nothing quite like a rainy day to make you want to sit back with a hot drink and a good story, and today we are going to be reading a story that I've never read before, Smith of Wootton Major by Tolkien. I hope the rain isn't too loud. I thought it would provide a nice ambiance, and I hope I wasn't wrong. Smith of Wootton Major was first published in 1967, but it began far earlier, originally written by Tolkien as a preface for the George MacDonald novel The Golden Key. George MacDonald was a Victorian author who specialized in fairy tales and fairy stories. These were read by both children and adults alike, including Tolkien and C.S. Lewis and a lot of his contemporaries. These were the kinds of stories that he was raised on. So it was really nice that he got asked to do a preface for a republication of these books that meant so very much to him. So here I'm going to read a little bit from a letter that Tolkien wrote to his friend Clyde Kilby about the genesis of Smith of Wootton Major. Sometime during 1964, I agreed with Pantheon Books to write a preface to George MacDonald's Golden Key, which they proposed to issue as a fairy tale for children. No doubt I was approached because I mentioned George MacDonald with praise in Tree and Leaf, but I had found that a highly selective memory had retained only a few impressions of things that moved me, and rereading George MacDonald critically filled me with distaste. So basically his childhood recollections of George MacDonald were very positive, but upon rereading in 1964, so after he had written The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings and had done a lot of meditating on the nature of story and fantasy, he found a lot to criticize about George MacDonald. When striving to say something useful in a preface, I found it necessary to deal with the term faery. Always necessary nowadays, whether talking to children or adults. In the course of this, I tried to give an illustration of faery, spelled F-A-E-R-Y, and said this could be put into a short story, like this, and then proceeded in what is the first version of Smith of Wootton Major. There I stopped, realizing that the short story had developed an independent life, and should be completed as a thing in itself. If I had gone on, I should only have written a severely critical or anti-essay on George MacDonald, unnecessary and a pity, since George MacDonald had performed great services for other minds, such as Jack's, that's C.S. Lewis. But he was evidently born loving moral allegory, and I was born with an instinctive distaste for it. So this is going into Tolkien's dislike of allegory, which is one of the most misunderstood and misquoted things about him when he said that he hates allegory. So that's something I've talked about in previous videos, but we'll definitely get into when it comes to the discussion of this story. I'm pretty sure I've never read this story before. Eventually the republication of George MacDonald's The Golden Key was abandoned, and so Tolkien didn't need to write this preface, although we do still have what he had written of the preface, and it was indeed very critical of George MacDonald and critical of the idea of prefaces as a whole, which is pretty funny. But Smith of Wootton Major, which I don't have a published copy of, so I just printed it out, Smith of Wootton Major survived and was turned into its own story and was published in 1967. So grab a blanket and a hot drink. This time I have hot chocolate. I almost always have water for videos, but I've treated myself this time. So grab yourself a drink and a blanket and get cozy, because today we are going to be reading and analyzing Smith of Wootton Major. Wootton? Wootton? I'm going to go with Wootton. Don't hate me if I'm wrong. There was a village once, not very long ago for those with long memories, nor very far away for those with long legs. Wootton Major, it was called, because it was larger than Wootton Minor, a few miles away in the deep trees, but it was not very large, though at times it was prosperous, and a fair number of folk lived in it. Good, bad, and mixed as is usual. Every once in a while, when he has these like asides where it's Wootton Major because it was larger than Wootton Minor, it is so reminiscent of Terry Pratchett. And obviously Terry Pratchett took from Tolkien, but it is interesting to see these kind of crossovers of voice where Terry Pratchett definitely pulled from Tolkien when it comes to these kind of comedic asides explaining the intricacies of the universe. It was a remarkable village in this way, being well known in the country roundabout for the skill of its workers in various crafts, but most of all for its cooking. It had a large kitchen which belonged to the village council, and the master cook was an important person. The cook's house and the kitchen adjoined the Great Hall, the largest and oldest building in the place and the most beautiful. It was built of good stone and good oak, and was well tended, though it was no longer painted gilded, as it had been once upon a time. As always, Tolkien does a masterful job of adding in history, even just to the descriptions of settings. In the hall, the villagers held their meetings and debates, and their public feasts and their family gatherings. So the cook was kept busy, since for all these occasions he had to provide suitable fare. For the festivals, of which there were many in the course of a year, the fare that was thought suitable was plentiful and rich. That's not an enviable job. There was one festival to which all looked forward, for it was the only one that was held in winter. It went on for a week, and on the last day at sundown there was a merrymaking called the Feast of Good Children, to which not many were invited. No doubt, some who deserved to be asked were overlooked, and some who did not were invited by mistake, for that is the way of things. However careful those who arrange such matters try to be. In any case, it was largely by chance of birthday that any child came in for the 24 feast, since that was only held once in 24 years, and only 24 children were invited. For that occasion, the master cook was expected to do his best, and in addition to many other good things, it was custom for him to make the great cake. By the excellence or otherwise of this, his name was chiefly remembered, for a master cook seldom if ever lasted long enough in office to make a second great cake. Okay, if you were making your great cake, what flavor would it be? Woo, baby. Because for me, I think it has to be chocolate. I am such a big fan of chocolate cake. Maybe something with chocolate mousse in it. But any bakers or people who enjoy eating cake, please let me know what your great cake would be. There came a time, however, when the reigning master cook, to everyone's surprise, since it had never happened before, suddenly announced that he needed a holiday. And he went away, no one knew where, and when he came back some months later, he seemed rather changed. He had been a kind man, who liked to see other people enjoying themselves, but he himself was serious and said very little. Now he was merrier, and often said and did the most laughable thing, and at feasts he would himself sing gay songs, which was not expected of master cooks. Also, he brought back with him an apprentice, and that astonished. It was not astonishing for the master cook to have an apprentice. It was usual. The master chose one in due time, and he taught him all that he could. And as they both grew older, the apprentice took on more of the important work, so that when the master retired or died, there he was, ready to take over the office and become master cook in his turn. But this master had never chosen an apprentice. He had always said, "Time enough yet," or "I'm keeping my eyes open and I'll choose one when I find one to suit me." But now he brought with him a mere boy, and not one from the village. He was more lithe than the Wootton lads, and quicker, soft-spoken, and very polite, but ridiculously young for the work, barely in his teens by the look of him. Still, choosing his apprentice was the master cook's affair, and no one had the right to interfere in it, so the boy remained and stayed in the cook's house until he was old enough to find lodgings for himself. People soon became used to seeing him about, and he made a few friends. They and the cook called him Alf, but to the rest, he was just Prentice. So that seems like our two characters. We have the cook, and we have Alf, aka Prentice. The next surprise came only 3 years later. One spring morning, the master cook took off his tall white hat, folded up his clean aprons, hung up his white coat, took a stout ash stick and a small bag, and departed. He said goodbye to the apprentice, and no one else was about. This guy knows what he's about, because just leaving? That's a power move. The cook says goodbye, tell them that I've gone on another holiday, that this time I shan't be coming back again. This is almost reminiscent of Bilbo vanishing at the beginning of The Lord of the Rings without really telling anybody. I mean, he told everybody, but he didn't really give them warning, except for the one protege, Frodo, or in this case, Prentice. So it's interesting to see these kind of repeated patterns of storytelling that Tolkien uses. He has his devices that he likes as a storytelling device, and he keeps using them, and I respect that. There was quite a stir in the village when Prentice gave this message to people who came to the kitchen. What a thing to do, they said, and without warning or farewell. What are we going to do without any master cook? He's left no one to take his place. In all their discussions, no one ever thought of making young Prentice into the cook. He'd grown a bit taller, but still looked like a boy, and he had only served for 3 years. In the end, for lack of anyone better, they appointed a man of the village, who could cook well enough in a small way. When he was younger, he had helped the master at busy times, but the master had never taken to him, and would not have him as apprentice. He was now a solid sort of man with a wife and children, careful with money. At any rate, he won't go off without notice, they said, and poor cooking is better than none. It is 7 years till the next great cake, and by that time he should be able to manage it. Nokes, for that was his name, the name of the new chef, was very pleased with the turn things had taken. He had always wished to become master cook, and had never doubted he could manage it. For some time, when he was alone in the kitchen, he used to put on the tall white hat, and look at himself in a polished frying pan, and say, "How do you do, master? That hat suits you properly. Might have been made for you. I hope things go well for you." Nokes is a bold man. I don't think things are going to go well for Nokes. Things went well enough, for at first Nokes did his best, and he had Prentice to help him. Indeed, he learned a lot from watching him slyly, though that Nokes never admitted. But in due course, the time for the 24 feast drew near, and Nokes had to think about making the great cake. Secretly, he worried about it. For although with 7 years' practice he could turn out passable cakes and pastries for ordinary occasions, he knew that the great cake would be eagerly awaited and would have to satisfy severe critics. I will say that children are some of the worst critics when it comes to food and stuff, just in general. They are harsh, they don't hold back, but it says not only the children. A smaller cake of the same materials and baking had to be provided for those who came to help at the feast. Also, it was expected that the great cake should have something novel and surprising about it, and not be a mere repetition of the one from before. I really hope my camera isn't getting wet at all, but you know what? That's okay. That's fine. So his chief notion was that it should be very sweet and rich, and he decided that it should be entirely covered in sugar icing, at which Prentice was a clever hand. That'll make it pretty and fairy-like, he thought. Fairies and sweets were two of the very few notions he had about the tastes of children. Ah, okay. This is an analogy for serving children fairy tales, and he's gonna go for the approach to make it too sweet and saccharine, which Tolkien did not like about children's fairy stories when they cater to the children. Maybe that was obvious to some of you, but I just figured out that analogy. Fairies and sweets were two of the very few notions he had about the taste of children. Fairies he thought one grew out of, but of sweets he remained very fond. Ah, fairy-like, he said. That gives me an idea. So it came into his head that he would stick a little doll on the pinnacle of the middle of the cake, dressed all in white, with a little wand in her hand ending in a tinsel star, and Fairy Queen written in pink icing around her feet. I will have to make this cake someday. But when he began preparing the materials for the cake making, he found that he had only dim memories of what should go inside a great cake. So he looked in some old books of recipes left behind by previous cooks. They puzzled him, even when he could make out their handwriting, for they mentioned many things that he had not heard of, and some that he had forgotten and now had no time to get, but he thought he might try one or two of the spices that the book spoke of. This is interesting. Again, I think that this is going into the storytelling analogy, where sometimes people will look back at old stories and say, what worked about Beowulf is that there was a big monster. So I'm gonna put a big monster in my book without understanding the how, why, and what of why monsters are put in these stories. So if you're pulling pieces from stories without any understanding of why they were put in the stories in the first place, I think it's a dangerous road to go down. Not like dangerous, I just don't think you're gonna end up with as good of a story. Because if you put Grendel in Malibu, California in 2023, it's not gonna have the same impact as Grendel in Beowulf times. So it's an interesting warning when it comes to using things from older stories. He scratched his head and remembered an old black box with several compartments in which the last cook had once kept spices and other things for special cakes. He had not looked at it since he took over, but after a search, he found it in the high shelf of the storeroom. He took it down and blew the dust off the lid, but when he had opened it, he found that very little of the spices was left, and they were dry and musty. But in one compartment, in the corner, he discovered a small star, hardly as big as one of our sixpences, black-looking, as if it were made of silver but was tarnished. That's funny, he said, as he held it up in the light. No, it isn't, said the voice behind him, so suddenly that he jumped. It was the voice of Prentice, and he had never spoken to the master in that tone before. Indeed, he seldom spoke to Nokes at all, unless he was spoken to first. Very right and proper in a youngster. He might be clever with icing, but he had a lot to learn yet, and that was Nokes' opinion. What do you mean, young fellow? He said, not much pleased. If it isn't funny, what is it? It's fae, said Prentice. It comes from fairy. And then the cook laughed. All right, he said. It means much the same, but call it that if you like. You'll grow up someday. Now can you just get on with stoning the raisins? If you notice any funny fairy ones, tell me. What are you going to do with the star, master? Said Prentice. Put it in the cake, of course, said the cook. Just the thing, especially if it's fairy, he sniggered. I dare say you've been to children's parties yourself, and not so long ago either, where little trinkets like this were stirred into the mixture, and little coins and whatnot. Anyway, we do that in this village. It amuses the children. I am kind of against the practice of putting trinkets and stuff in cakes. Like, king cakes are another thing entirely where you put the baby Jesus in a cake, but overall it seems like a choking hazard. But this isn't a trinket, master. It's a ray star, said Prentice. Interesting. So you've said already, snapped the cook. Very well, I'll tell the children. It'll make them laugh. I don't think it will, master, said Prentice. But it's the right thing to do, quite right. Who do you think you're talking to, said Nokes. In the time the cake was made and baked and iced, mostly by Prentice, as you are so set on fairies, I'll let you make the fairy queen, Nokes said to him. Very good, master, he answered. I'll do it if you are too busy. But it was your idea and not mine. It's my place to have ideas and not yours, said Nokes. Nokes guy sucks. No, not a Nokes stan. At the feast, the cake stood in the middle of the long table, inside a ring of 24 red candles. Its top rose into a small white mountain, up the sides of which grew little trees glittering as if with frost. On its summit stood a tiny white figure, on one foot like a snow maiden dancing, and in her hand was a minute wand of ice sparkling with light. It does sound gorgeous. The children looked at it with wide eyes, and one or two clapped their hands, crying, "Isn't it pretty and fairy-like?" That delighted the cook, but the apprentice looked displeased. They were both present, the master to cut up the cake when the time came, and the apprentice to sharpen the knife and hand it to him. Poor apprentice. There are neighbors yelling somewhere off in the distance. I'm sorry if you're hearing them. At last, the cook took the knife and stepped up to the table. I should tell you, my dears, that inside this lovely icing, there is a cake made of many nice things to eat, but also stirred well in there are many pretty little things, trinkets and little coins and whatnot. At least he's warning them about the items in their cake so that they don't just swallow them. That's probably good, probably better. There are 24 items in the cake, so there should be one for each of you, if the fairy queen plays fair. But she doesn't always do so. She's a tricky little creature. You ask Mr. Prentice. The apprentice turned away and studied the faces of the children. No, I'm forgetting, said the cook. There's 25 this evening. There's also a little silver star. A special magic one, so Mr. Prentice says. So be careful. If you break one of your pretty front teeth on it, the magic star won't mend it. But I expect it's a specially lucky thing to find, all the same. It was a good cake, and no one had any fault to find with it, except that it was no bigger than was needed. When it was all cut up, there was a large slice for each of the children, but nothing left over. No coming again. The slices soon disappeared, and every now and then a trinket or coin was discovered. Some found one, some found two, and several found none. For that is the way luck goes, whether there is a doll with a wand on the cake or not. But when the cake was all eaten, there was no sign of any magic star. Bless me, said the cook. And it can't have been made of silver after all, it must have just melted. That's really a health and safety violation. You can't just melt random substances into your cake. Or perhaps Mr. Prentice was right, and it was really magical, and it's just vanished and gone back to fairyland. Not a nice trick to play, I don't think. He looked at Prentice with a smirk, and Prentice looked at him with dark eyes, and did not smile at all. Prentice is getting more and more ominous by the minute, and I kinda like it. I'm gonna go see if there's a light I can turn on. Hang on. All the same, the silver star was indeed a fey star. The apprentice was not one to make mistakes about things of that sort. How does he know all of this? I guess he did come from a distant land. Who knows what they're teaching in school there? What had happened was that one of the boys at the feast had swallowed it without ever noticing, although he had found a silver coin in his slice and had given it to Nell, the little girl next to him. She looked so disappointed at finding nothing lucky in hers. He sometimes wondered what had really become of the star, and did not know that it had remained within him, tucked away in some place where it could not be felt, for that is what it was intended to do. There it waited for a long time, until its day came. It's probably better that it stays inside versus continuing out, because a silver star going through your digestive system, that'll do some damage. The feast had been in midwinter, but now it was June, and the night was hardly dark at all. The boy got up before dawn, for he did not wish to sleep. It was his 10th birthday. He looked out of the window, and the world seemed quiet and expectant. A little breeze, cool and fragrant, stirred the waking trees. Then the dawn came, and far away he heard the dawn song of birds beginning, growing as it came towards him, until it rushed over him, filling all the land round the house, and passed on like a wave of music into the west, as the sun rose above the rim of the world. It reminds me of faery, he heard himself say, but in faery, the people sing too. And that's faery spelled F-A-E-R-Y, which Tolkien differentiates as not being a fairy, as in like a little person with wings, but something that is of faery, which is kind of the catch-all term he uses to describe things that are otherworldly and fantastical, kind of. If you want to learn more about it, read On Fairy Stories. That is his comprehensive thesis on fantasy and fairy, and it's a very good book. Then the boy began to sing, high and clear in strange words that he seemed to know by heart, and in that moment, the star fell out of his mouth, and he caught it in his open hand. It was bright silver now, glistening in the sunlight, but it quivered and rose a little, as if it was about to fly away. Without thinking, he clapped his hand to his head, and there the star stayed, in the middle of his forehead, and he wore it for many years. Few people in the village noticed it, though it was not invisible to attentive eyes, but it became part of his face, and it usually did not shine at all. Some of its light passed into his eyes, and his voice, which had begun to grow beautiful as soon as the star came to him, had become ever more beautiful as he grew up. People liked to hear him speak, even if it was no more than a good morning. He's just got riz. The star just gave him riz. He became well known in his country, not only in his village, but in many others round, for his good workmanship. His father was a smith, and he followed him in his craft and bettered it. Smithson, he was called while his father was still alive, and then just Smith. Smith of Wootton Major. Did you get it? So he built many things and tools for the people around. They were strong and lasting, but they also had a grace about them, being shapely in their kind, good to handle and look at. But some things, when he had the time, he made for delight, and they were beautiful, for he could work iron into wonderful forms that looked as light and delicate as a spray of leaves and blossom, but kept the stern strength of iron, or seemed even stronger. Few could pass by one of the gates or lattices that he had made without stopping to admire it. He sang when he was making things of this sort, and when Smith began to sing, those nearby stopped their own work, came to the smithy to listen. It's interesting to me how whenever Tolkien is writing about creation, which in his own life, generally his creative efforts went into his writing, but when he is writing analogies or stories that are representative of his views on creation. So, for example, Leaf by Niggle. Niggle was a painter, and painting was the craft that he was concerned about. And in The Lord of the Rings, or just Middle-earth canon in general, smithing is a super common craft that he always comes back to as being a creative work. So you have people like Aule, the Valar smith, or Sauron. Those people, the crafting that they become obsessed with is writing. But almost nowhere, except you could maybe make an argument for Bilbo and Frodo, no one has that obsession with craft when it comes to writing. He never did a direct parallel one-to-one where it's a suffering author who's trying to write these stories. And I wonder if that's just because that would have hit too close to home, or that would have felt like too direct of an allegory, which he didn't really like. But there's definitely something to look at in why he keeps coming back to other forms of crafting, especially in this case smithing, as the creative art that his protagonists use, you know? So that's all that anybody around here knows about him, but in reality, Smith became acquainted with faery, and some regions of it he knew as well as any mortal can. Though since too many had become like Nokes, he spoke of this to few people, except his wife and children. His wife was Nell, to whom he gave the silver coin, oh my heart, and his daughter was Nan, and his son was Ned Smithson. From them, it could not have been kept secret anyway, for they sometimes saw the star shining in his forehead when he came back from one of the long walks he would take alone now and then in the evening, or when he returned from a journey. First off, I really love that he married Nell, the girl he gave the silver coin to. That's so cute. And also, I like that it is on long walks or long walking journeys that Smith is finding and connecting to faery, because Tolkien really believed in the power of a good stroll, of a good walk. So we're seeing in this narrative that for Tolkien, that's how he found faery, and he believed that that was a good way to find faery, was to go on walks. And I just think that's beautiful. I'm interrupting this broadcast to inform all of you that smelling good is really important. Whether you're a whimsical traveler named Smith from the village of Wootton Major, or just somebody who's listening to that story happened to somebody else. But if you're interested in smelling good, boy do I have some good news for you, because this video has been sponsored by Scentbird. Scentbird is a fragrance subscription service that sends you a new scent every month. And if you're not sure what you're looking for, go to their website or app for a really handy quiz that'll identify your scent profile and recommend products that you might like. With Scentbird, you can have any scent of your choosing mailed directly to your doorstep for just $17 a month, but if you use my coupon code SHIRE, you can get 55% off. That's just over $7 for that first order, available in the US and Canada. They sent me 3 scents to try this month: Mirrored Image, Peony Silk, and White Rose, and Lemon Leaves. They're all very woodsy and floral, which I quite like. Plus, each of these samples contains a crazy amount of product, so that is a full 30-day supply, which means you get to try out this scent for a whole month. Scentbird will also send you an incredibly convenient case for these fragrance bottles that you can just snap closed around it. And then in order to open it, you just slide it over or slide it back to lock it. I've been using Scentbird for years, and I love the way that they allow me to experiment with my fragrance experience from month to month. So check out the link in my description and use my code SHIRE to get yourself 55% off. That is just over $7. Thank you so much to Scentbird for sponsoring this video and supporting the channel, and let's get back into the video. From time to time he would go off, sometimes walking, sometimes riding, and it was generally supposed that it was on business. And sometimes it was, and sometimes it was not. But he had business of its own kind in faery, and he was welcome there. For the star shone bright in his brow, and he was safe as a mortal can be in that perilous country. The lesser evils avoided the star, and from the greater evils he was guarded. This is interesting that he's using this star as a, passport into faery, basically, a passport and guard. I wonder if we could look at the star, especially since he gained it as a child, look at the star as childlike imagination. And it's this willingness to indulge his imagination that allows him to see faery. That's probably one reading on it, but I'm sure we'll see more. For that he was grateful, for he soon became wise and understood that the marvels of faery cannot be approached without danger, and that many of the evils cannot be challenged without weapons of power too great for any mortal to wield. He remained a learner, an explorer, not a warrior. And though in time he could have forged weapons in his own world that would have had power enough to become the matter of great tales and be worth a king's ransom, he knew that in faery they would have been of small account. So among all the things he made, it is not remembered that he ever forged a sword, a spear, or an arrowhead. At first he walked, for the most part, quietly among the lesser folk and the gentler creatures in the woods and meads of fair valleys, and by the bright waters in which at night strange stars shone, and at dawn the gleaming peaks of far mountains were mirrored. Some of his briefer visits he spent only looking at one tree or one flower, but later in long journeys he had seen things of both beauty and terror that he could not clearly remember nor report to his friends, though he knew that they dwelled deep in his heart. For some things he did not forget, and they remained in his mind as wonders and mysteries that he often recalled. He makes mention here of elven mariners that were tall and terrible. Their swords shone and their spears glinted, and a piercing light was in their eyes. I wonder if those were some elves of Valinor, of Lord of the Rings. He has a lot of elven mariners, so that could very well be one of the elven mariners from his lore. That's nice. So it goes on. Far off there was a great hill of shadow, and out of that shadow, which was its root, he saw the king's tree springing up, tower upon tower into the sky, and its light was like the sun at noon, and it bore at once leaves and flowers and fruits uncounted, and not one was the same as any other that grew on the tree. Tolkien uses trees so much in his lore. For example, this is very similar to the 2 trees of Valinor, which was before the sun and moon were created. The 2 trees of Valinor lit up Middle-earth, acting as the sun and moon, and so this tree, which its light was like the sun at noon, is very reminiscent to Tolkien's trees, and he also uses the tree of the king, like the white tree in Minas Tirith, as well as in Leaf by Niggle. I did a video on that if you want to check that out, but the painting that this artist is painting is of a beautiful tree in a far-off fairy realm, basically. I'm intrigued at the fact that this tree is a recurring motif throughout his work. So there's a lot of beautiful descriptions of these things that are happening. At one point, he is chased by the wind, by the actual wind, and warned that the wind is hunting him and you do not belong here, go away and never return. But of course he does come back. And then later, he returns to Fairyland, and it says, "As he set foot upon the grass of the vale, he heard elven voices singing, and on a lawn beside a river, bright with lilies, he came upon many maidens dancing. The speed and grace and the ever-changing modes of their movement enchanted him, and he stepped forward towards their ring. Then suddenly they stood still, and a young maiden with flowing hair and a kilted skirt came out to meet him." This image of elven maidens dancing while a man watches is very evocative of Beren and Luthien, in which Luthien is dancing in the forest and Beren sees her and is entranced, and that is a throwback reference. It was Tolkien's own personal life experience of watching his wife Edith dance amongst the trees, and it's an experience that he writes about very specifically remembering, so it's nice to see this moment brought up in his other fiction. So the elven maiden laughed at him as she spoke, saying, "You are becoming bold, Starbrow, are you not? Have you no fear what the queen might say if she knew about this? Unless you've had her leave." He was abashed, for he became aware of his own thought, and knew that she read it, that the star on his forehead was a passport to go wherever he wished, and now he knew that it was not. But she smiled and spoke again. "Come, now that you are here, you shall dance with me." And she took his hand and led him into the ring. There they danced together, and for a while he knew what it was to have the swiftness and the power and the joy to accompany her. For a while. But soon, as it seemed, they halted again, and she stooped and took up a white lily from before her feet and set it in his hair. White lilies are also an image utilized in Beren and Luthien by the elven maiden Luthien, so definitely some parallels there. "Farewell now," she said. "Maybe we shall meet again, by the queen's leave." He remembered nothing of the journey home from the meeting, until he found himself riding along the roads in his own country, and in some villages, people stared at him in wonder and watched him till he rode out of sight. When he came to his own house, his daughter ran out and greeted him with delight. He had returned sooner than was expected, but none too soon for those that awaited him. "Daddy," she cried, "where have you been? Your star is shining bright." When he crossed the threshold, the star dimmed again, but Nell took him by the hand and led him to the hearth, and there she turned to look at him. "Dear man," she said, "where have you been and what have you seen? There is a flower in your hair." She lifted it gently from his head, and it lay on her hand. It seemed like a thing seen from a great distance, and yet there it was, and a light came from it that cast shadows on the wall of the room, now growing dark in the evening. The shadow of the man before her loomed up, and its great head was bowed over her. "You look like a giant, Dad," said his son, who had not spoken before. The flower did not wither nor grow dim, and they kept it as a secret and as a treasure. The smith made a little casket with a key for it, and there it lay, and was handed down for many generations in his kin. And those who inherited the key would at times open the casket and look long at the living flower, till the casket closed again. The time of its shutting was not theirs to choose. Tolkien really loves the idea of this familial relic, basically, that is handed down from generation to generation. When Gimli receives Galadriel's hair, that's what he does with the hair, is he makes it a relic that gets passed down throughout his family. So it's an interesting recurring idea. The years did not halt in the village. Many now had passed. At the children's feast, when he had received the star, the smith was not yet 10 years old. Oh! Duh! I wonder if the reason that when the cook came back from that long journey he was so happy is because he had received the star when he went away. And that's what made him happy when he came back, is that he had the fairy. Or something, but I don't know how it would have gotten off of his head. I don't know, just a theory, a game theory. At the children's feast, when he had received the star, the smith was not yet 10 years old. Then came another 24 feast, by which time Alf had become master cook, good for him, and had chosen a new apprentice, Harper. 12 years later, the smith had returned with the living flower, and now another children's 24 feast was due in the winter to come. One day in that year, Smith was walking in the woods of outer faery, and it was autumn. Golden leaves were on the boughs, and red leaves were on the ground. Footsteps came behind him, but he did not heed them or turn around, for he was in deep thought. On that visit, he had received a summons and had made a far journey, longer it seemed to him than any he had made yet. He was guided and guarded, but he had little memory of the ways that he had taken, for often he had been blindfolded by mist or by shadow, until at last he came to a high place under a night sky of innumerable stars. There he was brought before the Queen herself. She wore no crown and had no throne. She stood there in her majesty and her glory, and all about her was a great host shimmering and glittering like the stars above. But she was taller than the points of their great spears, and upon her head there was a burned white flame. She made a sign for him to approach, and trembling he stepped forward. A high, clear trumpet sounded, and behold, they were alone. He stood before her, and he did not kneel in courtesy, for he was dismayed, and felt that for one so lowly all gestures were in vain. At length he looked up and beheld her face, and her eyes bent gravely upon him, and he was troubled and amazed, for in that moment he knew her again. The fair maid of the green veil, the dancer at whose feet the flowers had sprang. She smiled, seeing his memory, and drew towards him, and they spoke long together, for the most part without words, and he learned many things in her thought, some of which gave him joy, and the others filled him with grief. I was not expecting that. I was not expecting the elven maiden to be the fairy queen. That's so cool. Then his mind turned back, retracing his life until he came to the day of the children's feast, and the coming of the star, and suddenly he saw again the little dancing figure with its wand, and in shame he lowered his eyes from the queen's beauty. But she laughed again, as she had laughed in the Vale of Evermorn. "Do not be grieved for me, Starbrow," she said, "nor too much ashamed of your own folk." Sorry, there are dogs barking in the distance. "Better a little dull, maybe, than no memory of fairy at all. For some, the only glimpse. For some, the awaking. Ever since that day you have desired in your heart to see me, and I have granted your wish. But I can give you no more. Now at farewell, I will make you my messenger. If you meet the king, say to him, the time has come. Let him choose." That's so beautiful. Oh, better a little dull than no memory of fairy at all. That is an excellent admission on Tolkien's part, because that's him admitting that even if it is a cheap saccharine version of fairy stories, of fantasy, that's still better than nothing. Because for some that might be the only glimpse, but for some it may be the awakening. That's why even bad fantasy stories, even little scraps of fantasy stories that we may find, are still beautiful, and they still may lead us deeper into fairy. There's sirens going off too. Sorry if you can hear those sirens. "But Lady of Fairy," Smith stammered, "where then is the king?" For he had asked this question many times of the people of Faery, and they had all said the same. "He has not told us." And the queen answered, "If he has not told you, Starbrow, then I may not. But he makes many journeys, and may be met in unlikely places. Now kneel of your courtesy." Is Alf the new master cook? Is Alf the king? I feel like Alf is the king, especially because Alf is very similar to the word elf. And elf fairy king. Then he knelt, and she stooped and laid her hand on his head, and a great stillness came upon him, and he seemed to be both in the world of fairy and also outside them and surveying them, so that he was at once in bereavement and in ownership and in peace. When after a while the stillness passed, he raised his head and stood up. The dawn was in the sky, and the stars were pale, and the queen was gone. Far off he heard the echo of a trumpet in the mountains. The high field where he stood was silent and empty, and he knew that his way now led back to bereavement. That hurts, that he at least gets, it's nice that he at least gets a glimpse of fairy, but it's also very hard to now say, okay, you're done, farewell, back to the real world with you. That meeting place was now far behind him, and here he was, walking among the fallen leaves and pondering all that he had seen and learned. The footsteps came nearer. Then suddenly a voice said at his side, "Are you going my way, Starbrow?" He started, and came out of his thoughts, and then he saw a man behind him. He was tall, and he walked lightly and quickly, and he was dressed in all dark green, and wore a hood that partly overshadowed his face. The smith was puzzled, for only the people of Faery called him Starbrow, but he could not remember ever having seen this man before, and yet he felt uneasily that he should know him. "What way are you going, then?" he said. "I am going back to your village," the man answered, "and I hope that you are also returning. This is definitely the king. I was wrong about Alf, this is for sure the king." "I am indeed," said the smith. "Let us walk together. But now something has come to my mind. Before I began my homeward journey, a great lady gave me a message. But we shall soon be passing from faery, and I don't think I shall ever return. Will you?" "Yes, I shall. You may give the message to me." "But the message was to the king. Do you know where to find him?" "I do. What was the message?" "The lady only asked me to say to him, 'The time has come. Let him choose.'" "I understand. Trouble yourself no further." It's not suspicious at all. They went on then, side by side in silence, save for the rustle of leaves about their feet. But after a few miles, while they were still within the bounds of faery, the man halted. He turned towards the smith and threw back his hood. Then the smith knew him. He was Alf, the apprentice, as the smith still called him in his own mind, remembering always the day when as a youth Alf had stood in the hall holding the bright knife for the cutting of the cake, and his eyes had gleamed in the light of the candles. He must be an old man now, for he had been the master cook for many years, but here, standing under the eaves of the outer wood, he looked like the apprentice of long ago, though more masterly. There was no gray in his hair, nor lines on his face, and his eyes gleamed as if they reflected a light. "I was right! I was right! I should like to speak to you, Smith Smithson, before we go back to your country," he said. The smith wondered at that, for he had himself often wished to talk to Alf, but had never been able to do so. Alf had always greeted him kindly, and had looked at him with friendly eyes, but had seemed to avoid talking to him alone. He was looking now at the smith with friendly eyes, but he lifted his hand, and with his forefinger touched the star on his brow. The gleam left his eyes, and then the smith knew that it had come from the star, and that it must have been shining brightly, but was now dimmed. He was surprised, and drew away angrily. "Do you not think, Master Smith," said Alf, "that it is time for you to give this thing up?" "What is that to you, Master Cook?" he answered. "And why should I do so? Isn't it mine? It came to me, and may a man not keep things that come to him so, at the least, as a remembrance? Some things, those that are free gifts and given for remembrance, but others are not so given. They cannot belong to a man forever, nor be treasured as heirlooms. They are lent. You have not thought, perhaps, that someone else may need this, but it is so. Time is pressing." Then the smith was troubled, for he was a generous man, and he remembered with gratitude all the star had brought him. "Then what should I do? Should I give it to one of the great in faery? Should I give it to the king?" And as he said this, a hope sprang in his heart that on such an errand he might once more enter faery. "You could give it to me," said Alf, "but you might find that too hard. Will you come with me to my storeroom, and put it back in the box where your grandfather laid it?" "I did not know that," said the smith. "No one knew but me. I was the only one with him." "Then I suppose you know how he came by the star, and why he put it in the box." "I did not realize that the cook was Smith's grandfather, the original cook. That's news to me, but I might have just missed it." "He brought it from faery. That you know without asking," Alf answered. "He left it behind in the hopes that it might come to you, his only grandchild. So he told me, for he thought that I could arrange that. He was your mother's father. I did not know whether she told you much about him, if indeed she knew much to tell. Ryder was his name. Ryder? Strider? Interesting. And he was a great traveler and had seen many things and could do many things before he settled down and became master cook. But he went away when you were only 2 years old, and they could find no one better to follow him than Nokes, poor man. Still, as we expected, I became master in time. This year, I shall make another great cake. The only cook, as far as remembered, to ever make a second one. I wish to put the star in it." "Very well, you shall have it," said the smith. He looked at Alf as if he was trying to read his thought. "Do you know who will find it?" "What is that to you, Master Smith?" "I should like to know, if you do, Master Cook. It might make it easier for me to part with things so dear to me. My daughter-child is too young." "It might, and it might not. We shall see," said Alf. They said no more, and they went on their way, until they passed out of faery and came at last back to the village. So they head back to the great hall, and then he felt a touch on his arm, and Alf led him round to a small door in the back. He opened it and led the smith down a dark passage into the storeroom. There he lit a tall candle, and unlocking a cupboard, he took down from the shelf a black box. It was polished now and adorned with silver scrolls. He raised the lid and showed it to the smith. One small compartment was empty. The others were now filled with spices, fresh and pungent, and the smith's eyes began to water. He put his hand to his forehead, and the star came away readily. But he felt a sudden stab of pain, and tears ran down his face. Though the star shone brightly again as it lay in his hand, he could not see it except as a blurred dazzle of light that seemed far away. "I cannot see it clearly," he said. "You must put it in for me." He held out his hand, and Alf took the star and laid it in its place. And it went dark. The smith turned away without another word and groped his way to the door. On the threshold, he found that his sight had cleared again. It was evening, and the even star was shining in a luminous sky close to the moon. As he stood for a moment, looking at their beauty, he felt a hand on his shoulder and turned. I was too into the story and my camera died, so I hope the shot is similar to what we had before. "You gave me the star freely," said Alf. "If you still wish to know to which child it will go, I will tell you." "I do indeed. It shall go to anyone that you appoint." The smith was taken aback and did not answer at once. "Well," he said, hesitating, "I wonder what you may think of my choice. I believe you have little reason to love the name of Nokes, but, well, his little great-grandson, Nokes of Townsend's Tim, is coming to the feast. Nokes of Townsend is quite different." "I have observed that," said Alf. "He had a wise mother. Yes, my Nell's sister. But apart from the kinship, I love little Tim, though he's not an obvious choice." Alf smiled. "Neither were you," he said. "But I agree. Indeed, I had already chosen Tim." "Then why did you ask me to choose?" "The queen wished me to do so. If you had chosen differently, I should have given way." The smith looked long at Alf, then suddenly he bowed low. "I understand at last, sir. You have done us too much honor." "I have been repaid," said Alf. "Go home now in peace." When the smith reached his own house on the western outskirts of the village, he found his son by the door of the forge. He had just locked it, for the day's work was done, and now he stood looking up the white road by which his father used to return from his journeys. Hearing footsteps, he turned in surprise to see him coming from the village, and he ran forward to meet him. He put his arms around him in loving welcome. "I've been hoping for you since yesterday, Dad," he said. Then looking into his father's face, he said very anxiously, "How tired you look. You have walked far, maybe?" "Very far indeed, my son. All the way from daybreak to evening." They went into the house together, and it was dark, except for the fire bickering on in the hearth. His son lit candles, and for a while they sat by the fire without speaking, for a great weariness and bereavement was on the smith. At last he looked round, as if coming to himself, and he said, "Why are we alone?" His son looked hard at him. "Why? Mother's over at Minor, at Nan's. It's the little lad's 2nd birthday. They'd hoped you would be there, too." "Ah, yes, I ought have been. I should have been, Ned, but I was delayed, and I had matters to think of that put all else out of mind for a time. But I did not forget Tomling." He put his hand in his breast and drew out a little wallet of soft leather. "I've brought him something. A trinket, old Nokes maybe would call it, but it comes out of faery, Ned." Out of the wallet he took a little thing of silver. It was like the smooth stem of a tiny lily, from the top of which came 3 delicate bowers, bending down like shapely bells. And bells they were, for when he shook them gently, each bower rang with a clear note. At the sweet sound the candles flickered, and then for a moment shone with white light. Ned's eyes were wide with wonder. "May I look at it, Dad?" he said. He took it with careful fingers and peered into the flowers. "The work is a marvel," he said. "And Dad, there's a scent in the bells. A scent that reminds me of something I've forgotten." "Yes, the scent comes for a little while after the bells have rung. But don't fear to handle it, Ned. It was made for a babe to play with. He can do no harm, and he'll take none from it." The smith put the gift back in his wallet and stowed it away. "I'll take it over to Wootton Major myself tomorrow," he said. "Nan and her Tom and mother will forgive me, maybe. As for Tomling, his time has not yet come for the counting of days, and of weeks and months and years." His son then begins wondering what had become of the star. He took his father's hand. "I am grieved for you, but there is good in it, too, for this house. Do you know, Master Smith, that there is much you can teach me if you have the time? And I do not mean only the working of iron." At last his son looked at him and said, "Father," he said, "do you remember the day when you came back with the flower, and I said that you looked like a giant by your shadow? The shadow was the truth, so it was the queen herself that you danced with." Yet you have given up the star. I hope it may go to someone worthy. The child should be grateful." "The child won't know," said the smith. "That's the way with such gifts. Well, there it is. I have handed it on and come back to hammer and tongs." So now he is going to be reigniting his relationship with his son, which is very sweet. I think that's nice. It's a strange thing, but old Nokes, who had scoffed at his apprentice, had never been able to put out of his mind the disappearance of the star in the cake, although that event had happened so many years ago. He had grown fat and lazy and retired from his office when he was 60. He was now near the end of his 80s and was of enormous bulk, for he still ate heavily and doted on sugar. Most of his days, when not at table, he spent in a big chair by the window of his cottage, or by the door, if it was fine weather. He liked talking, since he still had many opinions to air, but lately his talk mostly turned to the one of the great cake that he had made, for whenever he fell asleep it came into his dreams. Prentice sometimes stopped in for a word or two, so the old cook still called him, and he expected himself to be called master. That Prentice was careful to do, which was a point in his favor, though there were others that Nokes was more fond of. One afternoon Nokes was nodding in his chair by the door after dinner. He woke with a start to find Prentice standing by him and looking down at him. "Hello," he said. "I'm glad to see you, for the cake's been on my mind again, and was just thinking of it now, in fact. It was the best cake I ever made, and that's saying something. But perhaps you have forgotten it." "No, master, I remember it very well. But what is troubling you? It was a good cake, and it was enjoyed and praised. Of course, I made it, but that doesn't trouble me. It's the little trinket, the star. I cannot make up my mind of what came of it. Of course it wouldn't melt, I only said that to stop the children from being frightened. I have wondered if one of them did not swallow it. Yeah, that's what happens when you put toys in cake. But is that likely? You might swallow one of those little coins and not notice it, but not that star. It was small and had sharp points, which is maybe why you shouldn't have put it in a cake, but yes, master, but do you really know what the star was made of? Don't trouble your mind about it. Someone swallowed it, I assure you." "Then who?" Well, I have a long memory, and that day sticks in it somehow. I can recall all the children's names. Let me think. It must have been Miller's Molly. She was greedy and bolted her food. She's fat as a sack now." "Yes, there are some folk who get like that, master. But Molly did not bolt her cake. She found 2 trinkets in her slice." They go on naming and disparaging various children for eating too much. And then Nokes says, "I give up. Who was it? You seem to have been watching very closely if you're not making it all up." "It was the smith's son, master. And I think it was good for him." "Go on," laughed old Nokes. "I ought to have known you were having a game with me. Don't be ridiculous. Smith was a quiet, slow boy then. He makes much more noise now, a bit of a songster I hear, but he's cautious. No risks for him. Chews twice before he swallows, and always did, if you take my meaning." "I do, master. If you won't believe it was Smith, I can't help you. Perhaps it doesn't matter much now. Will it ease your mind if I tell you that the star is back in the box now? Here it is." From his cloak he produces the black box and opens it under the old cook's nose. "There is the star, master, down in the corner." Old Nokes began coughing and sneezing, but at last he looked into the box. "So it is," he said. "At least it looks like it." "It's the same one, master. I put it in there myself a few days ago. It will go back in the great cake this winter." "Aha!" said Nokes, leering at Prentice, and then he laughed till he shook like a jelly. I see. 24 children and 24 lucky bits, and the star was 1 extra. So you nipped it out before the baking and kept it for another time. You were always a tricky fellow, nimble one might say, and thrifty. Wouldn't waste a bee's knee of butter. Ha, so that was the way of it, I might have guessed. Well, that's cleared up, now I can have a nap in peace. Mind that prentice man of yours plays no tricks. The artful don't know the arts, they say." He closed his eyes. This guy sucks. Tolkien's really good at writing people that you kinda hate. "Goodbye, master," said Prentice, shutting the box with such a snap that the cook opened his eyes again. "Nokes," he said, "your knowledge is so great that I have only twice ventured to tell you anything. I told you that the star came from faery, and I have told you that it went with a smith. You laughed at me. Now at parting, I will tell you one thing more. Don't laugh again. You are a vain old fraud, fat, idle, and sly. I did most of your work, and without thanks, you learned all that you could from me, except respect for faery and a little courtesy. You have not even enough to bid me good day." "If it comes to courtesy," said Nokes, "I see none in calling your elders and betters by ill names. Take your faery and your nonsense somewhere else. Good day to you if that's what you're waiting for. Now go along with you. He flapped his hand mockingly. Is that mocking? If you've got one of your fairy fiends hidden in the kitchen, send him to me and I'll have a look at him. If he waves his little wand and makes me thin again, I'll think better of him. So that's him not understanding what fairy is, that it's not fairy, it's fairy, you know? Would you spare a few moments for the king of fairy? The other answered. To Nokes' dismay, he grew taller as he spoke. He threw back his cloak. He was dressed like a master cook at a feast, but his white garments shimmered and glinted, and on his forehead was a great jewel like a radiant star. His face was young but stern. Old man, he said, you are at least not my elder. As to my better, you have often sneered at me behind my back. Do you challenge me now openly? He stepped forward and Nokes shrank away from him, trembling. He tried to shout for help, but found that he could hardly whisper. No, sir, he croaked. Don't do me a harm. I'm only a poor old man. The king's face softened. Alas, yes. You speak the truth. Do not be afraid, be at ease. But will you not expect the king of fairy to do something for you before he leaves you? I grant you your wish. Farewell. Now go to sleep. He wrapped his cloak about him, and he went away towards the hall. But before he was out of sight, the old cook's goggling eyes had shut, and he was snoring. What a show-off. I love Prentice. I love Alf. What a guy. Dream man. When the old cook woke again, the sun was going down. He rubbed his eyes and shivered a little, for the autumn air was chilly. Ugh, what a dream, he said. Must have been that pork at dinner. From that day, he became so afraid of having more bad dreams of that sort that he hardly dared to eat anything for fear that it might upset him, and his meals became very short and plain. He soon became lean, and his clothes and skin hung from him in folds and creases. The children called him Old Rag and Bones. Then, for a time, he found that he could get about the village and walk again, with no more help than a stick, and he lived many years longer than he would otherwise have done. Indeed, it is said that he just made his century, the only memorable thing he ever achieved. So he lived 100 years because of the advice given to him by the Fairy King. That's awesome. But till his last year, he could be heard saying to any that would listen to his tale, alarming you might call it, but a silly dream when you come to think of it, the King of Fairy, why he had no wand, and if you stop eating, you grow thinner. That's natural. Stands to reason. There ain't no magic in it. I love this idea of granting a wish just through practical means, where like sometimes magic is just in the reality of situations. I'm currently rereading Terry Pratchett's Tiffany Aching books, and one of the major themes, especially in book 2 where I'm at right now, one of the major themes of that is that magic is real, sure. Like there are magical things and magical spells, but a lot of the times magic just comes from the things that we do. You know, these witches, the best witches, don't use magic to help the people of the village around them. They use herbs, and they use the fact that they are willing to go and help these people when nobody else will, and in that way, they are magical. And there was a specific quote that I'm thinking of that I will put up here, and I'll let you read it now, that I think is just really representative. So again, we see like where these lines of inspiration come from. The time for the 24 feast came around. Smith was there to sing songs and his wife to help with the children. Smith looked at them as they sang and danced, and he thought that they were more beautiful and lively than they had been in his boyhood. For a moment it crossed his mind to wonder what Alf might be doing in his spare time. Any one of them seemed fit to find the star. But his eyes were mostly on Tim, a rather plump little boy, clumsy in the dances but with a sweet voice in the singing. At the table he sat silent, watching the sharpening of the knife and the cutting of the cake. Suddenly he piped up. Dear Mr. Cook, only cut me a small slice, please. I've eaten so much already. I feel rather full. All right, Tim, said Alf. I'll cut you a special slice. I think you'll find it'll go down easy. Smith watched as Tim ate his cake slowly but with evident pleasure. Though when he found no trinket or coin, he looked rather disappointed. But soon a light began to shine in his eyes, and he laughed and became merry and sang softly to himself. Then he got up and began to dance, all alone, with an odd grace that he had never shown before. The children all laughed and clapped. All is well then, thought Smith. So you are my heir. I wonder what strange places the star will lead you to. Poor old Nokes. Still, I suppose he will never know what a shocking thing has happened in his family. He never did. But one thing that happened at the feast pleased him mightily. Before it was over, the master cook took leave of the children and of all others that were present. I will say goodbye now, he said. In a day or two I shall be going away. Master Harper is quite ready to take over. He's a very good cook, and as you know, he comes from your own village. I shall go back home, and I do not think you will miss me. The children said goodbye cheerfully and thanked the cook prettily for his beautiful cake. Only little Tim took his hand and said quietly, I'm sorry. In the village, there were in fact several families that did miss Alf for some time. A few of his friends, especially Smith and Harper, grieved at his going, and they kept the hall gilded and painted in memory of Alf. Most people, however, were content. They had him for a long time and were not sorry to have a change. But old Nokes thumped his stick on the floor and said roundly, He's gone at last, and I'm glad for one. I never liked him. He was artful. Too nimble, you might say. And that is Smith of Wootton Major. What a delight! What a great story! Oh my goodness, I have so many feelings. So I forgot to mention at the beginning of this video, but the illustrations that I've been showing are from Pauline Baines, who also did Farmer Giles of Ham. Her illustrations are just, they're excellent. I love them. They capture the semi-medieval feeling of all of Tolkien's works beautifully. That was intriguing. It plays into an idea that Tolkien really likes to use, which is the way that magic functions and how it passes in and out of your lives. And this, I think, is especially interesting because it plays with this idea of age and how our age affects the way that we interact with fairy stories. Because Smith, you know, got the star, this passport into fairy, what I think we could consider like the power of imagination. He got it as a child and was able to hang on to it until he was an adult. But at a certain point, he became too old for it and had to pass that imagination, that adoration and ability to travel into fairy onto the next generation. So I think that can be analogous to multiple things, like the passage of your imagination as you grow up and how you can't spend all your time frolicking in fairy once you've become an adult. But I also think it has to do with the authorship of fantasy and how someone like Tolkien walks in fairy to create and live in these stories, but eventually he's going to get to a point in his life where he can't anymore, where he's going to get too old to keep writing and he's going to die. This image of willingly passing that creative gift, that imaginative gift onto the next generation is so beautiful and so important. I know that originally this was written as a critique of fairy stories, basically of George MacDonald's fairy stories, to say that fairy stories aren't just for children and that a good fairy story for children is just a good story. I think it is interesting that we kind of lose that theme a little bit more. That theme is much more prevalent in the first half rather than the latter half of the story, which kind of goes into this idea that Tolkien started writing this as a preface, as a critique of George MacDonald's works, and then it became something more. It became an exploration into the power of fairy, the power of fantasy, what it means to be of fairy, to enter the realm of fairy. And it's just, oh, it's a beautiful exploration. I'm gonna have to do a lot more reading on this, especially because it's so short. That means that I know there's gonna be so much information jam-packed into every single sentence. So I am so excited to read this again and keep rereading it, because I think it is really gonna stand the test of time when it comes to rereads. This also beautifully demonstrates the way that Tolkien writes allegory. Something like his short story Leaf by Niggle is good and has varied application for allegory, but it is a fairly singular interpretation. You can watch my video about it, but basically it is someone's journey of trying to create, and then death happens, and what happens to unfinished works once you've passed. It's a very vague explanation, but it's the gist. It's a relatively singular allegory, whereas this has so many allegorical threads to pull from. There's so much happening here, and you can't just interpret it as this is what Tolkien was trying to say. There were 100 different things that he was trying to say, and the way that he pulls threads from his previous works really just epitomizes the way in which these works were internalized to him. It's possible that he was carefully planning out these references, but in all likelihood, when it came to exploring a fantasy world, he just thought of a tree of light because that was one of the images that was so strong in his head. I love the way that we are able to meet Tolkien through his works, that you can find so much of who Tolkien is through what he writes. You can figure out what's important to him, what he was struggling with, what he found beautiful in the world, and where he found magic. This is a wonderful story. Please let me know in the comments if you've read it before, or if this was your first time experiencing this story. Tell me what you thought, because I have so many thoughts happening, and there's so many ways to interpret this, and I want to hear what you guys have to think. So let me know if you've read it before, or if this was your first time reading it, because I love these little gems of short stories that we find scattered throughout his body of work. If you want to discuss this with me outside of YouTube, my Patreon is linked in the description, so check that out if you want to support the channel and talk to me and other Tolkien people on Discord. But either way, just liking this video and subscribing does a whole lot to support what I'm doing here. I'm sure that technically this wasn't the cleanest video ever. I know it's been getting dark, so my lighting is a little bit crazy right now, and the rain was perhaps loud, but I really just needed to sit down this week with you guys and read a story, and I really love sharing these stories with you guys. So thank you for taking the time to enjoy this story with me. And of course, thank you to Scentbird for sponsoring this video. Make sure you use my coupon code SHIRE to get yourself 55% off your first month. Thanks for joining me, and I hope that you have a very happy, hobbity day.